The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Between the years 1939 and 1945, aircrafts were starting to become more popular as a major weapon in warfare, with every aircraft requiring skilled pilots and an aircrew to control the aircraft effectively in war. As a result, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the BCATP, was created to help in the training of tens of thousands of men and women to use airplanes of all sorts effectively in war. Between 1940 and 1945, the BCATP built about 150 schools all over Canada with the intention of training men and women to be pilots and aircrews. The schools that they built were operated by the force of about 104,000 Canadian men and women. By the end of World War II, the BCATP had trained 131,000 pilots, bomb aimers, air gunners, wireless operators, flight engineers and navigators for Allied aircrews. What was Canada's involvement in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan? In the Second World War, the British government looked to their dominions for help with the training of aircrews. This was because the UK didn't have enough airspace to do any training or even to build the operational facilities that they needed. Another thing that made Britain a less than ideal location was that they were an easy target for the enemies. They then looked to Canada because of the many advantages it had, such as having easy transportation of men and supplies, excellent climate conditions for flying. It had a large capacity for manufacturing aircrafts and access to the US industry for plane parts. Coupled with the fact that Canada had the Royal Flying Corps of Canada during the First World War, made it the perfect spot for the BCATP. With these considerations in mind, the UK then made a proposal to Canada in September 1939. Prime Minister William Lyon John Mackenzie King was skeptical about how much it would cost the Canadian government. He later changed his mind when Parliament declared war on Nazi Germany. In that same year, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia and Canada signed the BCATP agreement on the 17th of December 1939. This also happened to be Prime Minister King's birthday. Once Prime Minister King signed the agreement, he was proud because he had secured a major role for Canada in the Second World War. The BCATP agreement outlined how many people each country would be required to send to be trained. It said how much money each country must contribute to the success of the project, when the autodromes would open, and it included training plan schedules. When the BCATP came to close, the four governments had spent $2.2 billion, and $1.6 billion of that was the Canadian share. Along with being a major part of Canada's contribution to the war, the BCATP also provided many economic benefits. As air training bases were being built, companies were given contracts for supplying materials. Many residents in Canada were employed in the construction of air training bases. Merchants would also rely on the construction of the BCATP to pay for their checks, especially when it came to housing, food, clothing, and many more important essentials. Companies still benefited after construction was finished for supplying services such as water, electricity, natural gas, and food to the bases. The BCATP thought very highly of their recruits, thus they were expecting a lot from them. The training plan the BCATP had created included an exhausting curriculum on top of intense classroom and air training schedules. This meant they could train recruits very quickly. Elementary training consisted of 50 hours of flight and 8 weeks of training. The planes they used were the de Havilland Tiger Moth, Fleet Finches, and the Fairchild Cornell. More successful recruits would advance into service flying training schools. Over there, recruits would learn more advanced instructions and would end up having a flight time that varied between 70 and 100 hours. The course was around 10 to 12 weeks long, and potential fighters would train on single-engine planes such as the North American Harvards. Other more skilled pilots would be selected to work with bomber, transport and coastal planes that had twin engines. The official opening days for the air bases normally were announced once the base had been operational for a while. Residents would go around and tour the buildings, getting a look at a great variety of planes ranging from Tiger Moths, Avro Alsons, Fairy Battles and Bristol Browning Brokes. The opening day for one base in High River, Alberta was a fairly normal opening. It included speeches, formation flying and stunt flying, which included aerial loops, spins and wing overs, ending the celebration with a midnight supper and a dance. The BCATP had trainees come from all over the world to visit small communities in which the bases were built. Regina had welcomed the first load of its trainees with a marching band, an afternoon of sports, and with a nice roast dinner. At the end, there was a lot of risks when it came to learning to fly, and there were horrible accidents that occurred. Around 856 participants died in training. Not only did civilians help by getting employed as cooks, mechanics, clerks, engineers, and laborers for BCATP aerodromes, but they also helped by instructing and operating schools for flight training. All of the 10 air observer schools were operated by local companies, airlines, and flight clubs. Civilians didn't only operate air observer schools, but they also operated 29 elementary air training schools. The civilians' participation sparked something in the BCATP that had kept it growing and growing. Canada looked over the control of the plan with standards and overall policy set by the RAF. The training program was carried out by the RCAF, accompanied by the Canadian Flying Clubs Association, aviation companies, and the Federal Department of Transport. Training began on 29 April 1940, but was hindered at first by a shortage of aircraft, instructors, and completed airfields. After the collapse of France in June 1940, the program was boosted, and the first group of transfers of employees from RAF aircrew schools to Canada were in place. In 1942, after the development of the agreement and the organization of the plan, all British units in Canada were merged properly into the BCAPT. The BCATP was a very successful plan, and by late 1943 there was a huge reserve of well-trained men ready for any operational posting. When the war in Europe had come to an end, many BCATP schools had started shutting down in 1944. This, however, was a sad event for the communities, as they had bonded between the schools and them. This not only affected the community, but as the air training schools were shutting down, this meant the payment and the boost in economy would have come to an end. Multiple past reminders of the BCATP can be seen in Canada today. The airports of various cities and towns were once part of the BCATP aerodrome foundation and infrastructure. Some of these civilian aerodromes may have already been built in 1939, but they got a significant upgrade and a modernized look, such as paved runways and runway extensions, to meet the BCATP requirements. Many other communities entered the experience of commercial aviation for the first time when commandeering over the RCAF training aerodromes in their areas once the schools had closed. Various military bases in use today used to be BCATP schools, and even Canada's participation in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, air training stems from the BCATP legacy of the Second World War.